When the train stopped running and the automobile took over, the old industrial Portsmouth, the kind of city that we'd been in the 19th and early 20th centuries, died. The death took decades, but Portsmouth as an urban industrial center withered away once the transportation network stopped directing traffic into downtown Portsmouth and started directing it around it instead. Portsmouth government policy since the 1950s has basically been built around the question of what to do to build a new Portsmouth in the wake of the disappearance of the old lifeblood of the city. The shipyard actually predates Portsmouth as a city. The city of Portsmouth developed to service the shipping industry that grew up here starting in the 18th century. A series of small shipyards developed on the western bank of the Elizabeth River around a sandbar, which just happened to be at the right height so that a ship could sail cleanly over it at high tide. But when the tide went out, the ship would beach itself, and if this acted as a natural dry dock, you could then careen the ship over, tilt it on its side, so that you could do repairs under the waterline of the ship. Replace planking, scrape barnacles, that sort of thing. And so Colonel Crawford could bring in foreign manufactured goods for both his own plantation and the neighboring farms. And he and his neighbors could ship the local tobacco out to European ports. As for imports, pretty much everything else, plows, iron goods, machinery, glassware, anything needed from overseas. Sugar. Portsmouth brought in a lot of Caribbean goods. And of course, slaves and indentured servants in the 17th and 18th centuries as well. In the 1820s, better steam engines made rail transport more practical, and the first railroad in Virginia ran from Portsmouth, originally just to Suffolk, but was eventually extended down to North Carolina to connect the area by rail and be able to bring in more cargo more regularly than the relatively shallow Dismal Swamp Canal could handle. The rail station for the Portsmouth and Roanoke rail line was right at the foot of High Street at the water. The nickname of Portsmouth was Where Rail Meets Sail, or one of its nicknames. And the rail station ran for several blocks right along the waterfront in the 19th century. The headquarters of the Seaboard Railroad was constructed at the foot of High Street, and that building still stands. It's the white building with the semicircular front by the ferry landing. Railroads meant you could also run these transportation lines over hills and mountain ridges that disrupted traditional shipboard traffic. The reason so many Virginia cities form kind of a straight line through the middle of the state, Alexandria, Fredericksburg, Richmond, Petersburg, Danville, is that they all sit on rivers right at the fall line, spots where the rivers suddenly drop steeply. You get rapids and shoals, and river transportation, at least by large ships, becomes impossible moving further upstream. Those cities existed initially as places where people could unload cargo from ships coming up from the Atlantic and put them on barges going further up the navigable rivers past those falls. Railroads meant that you could bypass those choke points and connect coastal towns like Portsmouth and Norfolk to deep inland ports, which is why you get coal from the Appalachian Mountains going into Hampton Roads and those huge coal piles in Newport News even now. Because Portsmouth became an early rail center in Virginia, the very first in fact, it became a transportation hub for a much larger economic backcountry. Portsmouth also drew customers because the ferry landing stopped here in Portsmouth, and because the ferry only traveled at set periods, and because the trains from Portsmouth to outlying areas only left at set periods, people would come in, do shopping and other kinds of business here in downtown while waiting for the next train or the next ferry to take them on to their new location. And the downtown business district depended heavily on people who were drawn in by this transportation net. and this pause in their journey. Passenger rail has died in Portsmouth. The light rail system was torn up in the 1950s and 60s. The passenger trains stopped running in Portsmouth a long time ago. They stopped running in Norfolk for years too, but they've recently been revived. However, Portsmouth still has freight rail, and there are rail lines that run to carry shipping containers from the port facilities up and down the Elizabeth River to points inland. So rail transport is still commercially important for Portsmouth, even though it no longer has a passenger rail line, either streetcars or intercity. When the downtown tunnel was constructed in the 1950s and people no longer had to stop for the ferry, this caused the downtown retail market to dry up and was one of the major factors in Portsmouth's transition from an industrial and transportation center to the community we have now that's trying to redefine itself. Because Portsmouth was originally established as a shipping center for local agriculture and industry, it had much wider streets than the typical colonial or early 19th century Virginia town. In fact, High Street was the widest street in Virginia for a long time, 100 yards wide, because it and several other streets in downtown Portsmouth, like County Street, were set up to handle freight wagons moving out into the surrounding counties. And this meant that when automobiles were developed and these roads were paved over, these streets were already wide enough to handle multi-directional automobile traffic. And so in the early 20th century, when automobiles were a new and growing market that were supplemental to ferries and railroads and that sort of thing, the automobile brought more traffic into Portsmouth. Those wide accommodating streets made it a great spot for people to drive in, and if they needed to cross the river, new larger ferries that could accommodate automobile traffic replaced the older, smaller 19th century ferries. So people drove into Portsmouth, parked, did their shopping, then drove their cars onto the Elizabeth River Ferry and moved on to Norfolk. So Portsmouth accommodated rail and bus traffic very well at first. There was a Greyhound station here, actually, just a block away from where we're filming this now, right on Court Street. But as new highway systems were built, the flow of transportation changed. Portsmouth was left behind. The construction of bridges over the Elizabeth River and then bridge tunnels displaced the ferry traffic, and instead of automobiles stopping in downtown Portsmouth or downtown Norfolk, people doing their shopping and business and then moving on, they could just go straight through and bypass those old hubs. The interstate highway system further diverted traffic and encouraged people to move out into an ever-expanding zone of suburbs. So that drew even more capital away from the old downtown districts. It drew more people away. New and modern buildings went up to service those suburbs, and the older established buildings in downtown Portsmouth found themselves too old-fashioned to compete. So the construction of new hospitals in what had been rural farm country that was now easily accessible by car meant that the old St. Mary's Hospital in downtown Portsmouth became superfluous. So there goes another major business in the area. And so the kind of transportation system we have now that depends on interstate highways and multi-lane state roads has been very bad for communities that depended on directed traffic creating these tight nodes. And ever since the 1950s, Portsmouth has been struggling to find ways to redefine itself as an attractive location when the transportation grid is no longer giving us a leg up, but instead pushing people away from the area.